Hello, and welcome to our new series on women in the Bible. For many women, the Bible offers a different lens in which to view ancient womanhood. Deborah ranks among one of the most famous women in the Old Testament. Not only is she known for her wisdom, but she is praised for her courage. Deborah pictures an illustration of leadership, one that wasn't normally seen of women in the society of her time. With me today to talk on the topic of both the spiritual and civil leadership of Deborah is my friend and fellow servant, Susie Fahmy. Welcome, Susie. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Who is a servant at St. Mary, St. Antonius Coptic Orthodox Church in Queens, New York. Hello.
Hello.
So it's good to be with you and talk about this wonderful topic of Deborah.
Indeed.
So to start, Susie, can you just set the scene for us? Before we even discuss on who Deborah is, where do we read about Deborah in the Bible? And what was going on during this era in Israel?
Okay. So Deborah is found, her story in the book of Judges in the Old Testament, and you really start to talk and hear about her in chapter 4 and 5 predominantly. But this is an era, if you can imagine, it was a pretty vicious cycle for the Israelites. It was a cycle of them rejecting God in favor of idols, suffering at military conquests of the enemies, crying out to the Lord to save them for deliverance, and then God sending them a deliverer, and then them following the deliverer, who is usually a prophet or a judge, until that person, no longer existed, and them forgetting their ways and going back into this cycle of rejecting God, asking. And so this repetitive cycle is recorded in the book of Judges, which refers to a time again when, as they say, quote in the Bible, Judges 21 verse 25, every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So again, during this period, God used the judges, the deliverers, to deliver his people from afflictions. And the servants that God used to judge his people were typically men, except for this one woman who we're going to discuss today, and her name was Deborah.
And just to reiterate, what was the role of the judge?
Again,
I know you mentioned
the judge was to be the deliverer, to actually help give the message, to help in civil disputes, and to do what typically judges do today. But their highest command was God himself.
Right. Now, who is Deborah?
Deborah was, number one, a wife. She was a prophetess, and she was a judge. Again, as said in Judges 4:4. As a prophetess, God used her to deliver his message to the people. As a judge, God gave her the authority to render civil court cases and decisions. And in Deborah's case, Israel lacked leadership, it lacked courage, it lacked wisdom, it lacked faith, and it lacked zeal for God's ways. They were tired of constantly struggling to uphold the law, to uphold the commandments. After a while, they just gave in and said, you know what? We'll just tolerate our neighbors, the pagans, the idolaters. And God knew that his people needed a wise judge who would render just decisions, someone who would reject the folly of human reasoning and place their trust in him. And she happened to be the only woman judge in the era of time that we're discussing.
So she had three roles, as you said. She was a wife, a prophetess, and a judge.
Exactly.
Now, why Deborah, and what did she do?
So in Judges 4 verse 5, it tells you, quote, Deborah dwelt under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in Mount Ephraim, and the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. Note that she didn't go to the people. The people came to her. So she must have been known for her sound-mindedness and her sense of justice. The Israelites came to her to receive decisions. They believed in her. They trusted her. She was easy to talk to. She was also recognized for her sense of decency. We know this because as a prophetess, she was very careful to the voice of God's will and not her own. She was yielding to him, and she always referred to God's will. God said, God, was who was leading her. It wasn't her. It wasn't her pride.
So giving him and foremost all the credit.
Exactly.
Because
Absolutely.
it wasn't her that was relaying the message.
Exactly.
Her relaying it, but taking it from God to the people.
Absolutely. And so let me tell you a little bit about what she did.
Right.
So God commanded Deborah to call a man named Barak, coincidentally, whom he planned to use for a special military mission. When Barak came before her, and again, he was the head of the military at that time, she said to him, and I quote from the Bible, "Listen to the words of the eternal God of Israel." This is in Judges 4, verse 6. "Go gather 10,000 warriors from the tribe of Naphtali and Zebulun and get ready to do battle at Mount Tabor. I shall bring Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, against you." That's the commander of the Canaanites, okay?
So I'm going to just stop you right there, just so we paint this picture. So we have Deborah calling
Barak.
Barak.
Right.
So Deborah and Barak kind of,
They're on
we
one
could
side.
say one team.
Yep.
And then we have Jabin and Sisera,
Right.
who are another team. And both of them
Exactly.
ultimately will.
They're at odds, right?
Yes.
And so the message continues as she's talking to Barak. She said, God is telling you, I shall bring you victory over his chariots of iron and his fighting force, and I will deliver Sisera into your hands. Sisera, again, is the military lead of Jabin. Into your hands at the river Kishon. So again, for years, the Israelites, remember, they were intermarrying with these idol-worshiping pagan nations. And again, God commanded them a long time ago, that's not what you should do. If anything, you should get rid of them. You should destroy them, anything pagan related. So again, God comes to the situation which he's found himself in many times. He has to teach his people a lesson. And he uses this situation of basically Jabin, of the king of Canaan, to destroy, really to punish the Israelites. They were under their very harsh ruling for so many years. So again, Jabin sends during this time, right, as Deborah's saying this, he sends 900 deadly iron-wheeled chariots and a massive army to descend upon the Israelites at this time. And of course, panic and terror engulfs the country, engulfs the people, and of course, Deborah is expecting the minute she tells Barak this, that he would immediately run out and do what she said. But Barak was enslaved by fear, and this kept him from fully trusting God's plan and God's delivery. So he kind of gave Deborah an ultimatum, and I quote, he says, "If you go with me," this is in verse 8, "then I will go. But if you will not go, then I will not go." It's pretty straightforward. Now, Deborah didn't do what you might think she is. I mean, she is a judge. She's not a warrior. She's a prophet. She's not a warrior. But she believed in God, and she trusted in him, and she didn't say what you would say, look, this is not my place. The message was for you to do it. She could have, basically leveraged her role and pushed him. She didn't do any of that. She basically filled the gap that Barak couldn't fill and left the rest to God. She was taken aback by the demand, don't be mistaken, but she answers, quote, "I will surely go with you." But this is the interesting part. "Notwithstanding the journey that you take shall not be for your honor. For the Lord shall sell Sisera," again, the commander, the chief commander of the Canaanites, "into the hands of a woman." So she's basically telling him, you can have your way, but just know it, Barak, that defeat will come in the hands of a woman, not in the hands of the commander of the military.
Now, do you think Barak at that point thought that she would be that key role to defeat
He probably
Sisera?
did, because as the story unfolds, we realize something fascinating, that God used the most unsuspecting woman to bring the defeat of the Canaanites, and specifically Sisera. But again, her big message to him is the glory will not be yours because you didn't trust. So again, she didn't take any of this as a limit. She could have said this is a limitation, but she did not limit God, and that was very powerful. And she didn't think of herself, oh, again, I'm a woman, woe me, God couldn't possibly use me. She accepted her role as a judge and as a prophetess, and she allowed God to do with her as he saw fit. and again, on the other hand, so she and Barak were supposed to work together as a team, and that is what happened. They did work together as a team, and he did lead the team in battle. And Deborah was supposed to provide wise counsel and support and express God's will throughout, this endeavor. And again, because Barak initially failed to provide strong leadership, again, Deborah,
because of him being
afraid.
Right,
Yeah, he was
disobeying
basically paralyzed.
the initial.
Exactly.
Right.
Deborah had to stand in the gap and fill it. So in the end, it was Jael, who's the wife of Heber, who defeated Sisera. And basically the way she did it, Sisera walked in to what he thought was a safe haven, a tent, where he saw Jael, and her family, and there was what he thought peaceful between their families and his family. But while he was sleeping, taking refuge, he basically took the peg of the tent, right, and a hammer, and while he was resting and undercover, she basically bashed it into his forehead and killed him.
So he thought he was safe,
Yeah.
resting there,
Right.
but it became like a trap for him.
Basically, yes. What looked and appeared to the human eye as a safe haven was actually God's trap for him.
So tell us about Deborah's character and strengths.
Okay. So she was, first and foremost, an exceptional servant. She stood for courage in a time of fear. She stood for godly wisdom in a time of human reasoning. When every man did, like we said, every man did what was right in his own eyes. She stood for decency in a time of chaos, in a time of sexual perversity and idolatry. She was a leader who was an exception to the rule at the time. And sadly, an exceptional character like that was not only uncommon then, but it's uncommon now. Today, many people believe they have the right to do what they want and go where they want and be who they want with no fear or consequence to their creator.
It's funny that you even mentioned that, because we do live in a society where it's all about living in the moment and what makes me happy, and whatever makes me happy at this moment is what I'm going to do. We don't really think about consequences. We are just living in the moment of what I want to do now, not what are the consequences of what I do now.
And something else to know about Deborah, when this victory came to her and Barak with the help of Jael, they didn't, jump up and, they gave glory where glory was due. The next chapter was this beautiful song that they sung, which basically was giving praise and honor to their deliverer.
Deborah and Barak.
Yeah,
yes.
Their deliverer, who is the Lord God of Israel. And they never forgot who brought them, who delivered them, and who helped them conquer.
So why do you think God chose a woman, someone who was of relatively low status in the Israelite society, to be his chosen agent of restoration?
Okay. Well, it is true. The Bible clearly shows that God uses men to head his work. But this is not to say that God doesn't use women. And in fact, he does. And we see many examples, the most obvious of which is St. Mary, the Mother of God. I mean, she had a very critical role for our salvation. And he has used, lots of women throughout the Bible. And just as he's done with prophets like Elijah and Jeremiah and others, God has worked through prophetesses. And the bottom line is a prophet or a prophetess is a servant of God who's God inspired to record his message to the people at large and to certain leaders. And that, anybody who is providing the message, providing part of God's plan for anyone's salvation, is all part of God's plan. He really reminds us that women are not just going to be used, but they're of critical use.
Right. And I think it's actually important to even note that women played a large part in our Lord's ministry. Not only were they, we could even say, the last people to leave the Lord at the cross, but possibly even the first one to see him resurrected. Sure. So they did have a strong role. They weren't like a minority to our Lord. He didn't forget them just because, of them being of that gender.
Exactly. There's many examples in the Old and the New Testament that speak to that.
Right. So why do you think Deborah was received, being that she was a woman, she was received as a leader by the people?
So
how do you think that
yeah.
was?
she was highly regarded and she was respected for her wisdom and her strength and her modesty and in general how she carried herself. And again, it was evident, if you recall, she didn't go to look and see who needs help. People came to her. And that in itself tells you of how people perceive you. And in general, even the military commander listened to her.
What can we learn about leadership and the way that God operates based on him choosing Deborah and her unique gifts and role basically in the life of Israel?
Okay. So I believe it teaches us threefold. Number one, God does not always pick his servants the way we would pick. He sees straight to the heart. Number two, the best leaders are first and foremost the best servants. And number three, wisdom, courage, decency, a servant's heart, submitting to God are all signatures of a good leader.
And just to actually add on to that, I think like nowadays when we think of a leader, we think of somebody who's famous. We think of somebody with money. We think of somebody who has this high position. She didn't really have a high position in Israel. Like, she didn't come from a family that was of royalty.
Yeah.
Whereas when we give this leadership title of nowadays, we look at everything that's so superficial, which is just all these tangible things. And I think in the end, probably what I could think of is when you just mentioned that is in the Gospel of even Matthew, when they say, when the disciples ask him, who's the greatest? Exactly. And he says, actually, the little kids, and he takes a little child and he says, this is the greatest.
Right. Our minds cannot understand fully, but we have had many examples where we expect A and it's a totally different. Even the disciples being picked. I mean, it wasn't the rich and the famous. It was the unlikely that changed the world, that were part of his great plan.
And it gives us a meaning that we do all have a purpose and we all have a meaning but we just need to give God that time and wait on his time to allow him to work through us. So why do you think the high role of Deborah in Judges should play a part in determining what role women can and should play in church today? And why or why not?
So the women in today's church do play a critical role already, and that may not be obvious to everybody, but again, roles in the church are not determined by the uniform you're wearing, but by the service you're called to provide. So be it a teacher of the word in your own home or in the church, an organizer of functions, a fundraiser, a chorus director, a negotiator, a chef, a defender of the poor and needy, a talk show host. I mean, whatever it is, that calling is going to be fulfilled by women and obviously men as well, but it does not preclude women. I would say that for anyone to say women don't have a role in the church haven't been noticing what's been happening.
Right, and we all complete each other. It's not just this one member that preaches, but we do need that organizer. We do need this person who's going to prepare the food, who's going to clean, who's going to be in charge of fundraisers, who's going to help. It's not just about, I think sometimes we even limit the service to who's the Sunday school teacher.
Yes.
And that's it.
No, it's far from it.
And it would be a shame. Right. And I think in the end, sometimes we're so closed-minded as to service just being limited on whoever's saying the sermon.
Right, exactly. I mean, a call to action would be is that everyone, not just women, should look around and see where are the services lacking, and which of those things can I fulfill versus which of those should I, be complaining about.
So to conclude, what can we learn from Deborah's example?
So, A, that we can truly trust in the Lord to use us in his army as he sees fit, and that his vision into our hearts and his plans for our lives are far superior than anything we can imagine for ourselves. And really, no person or era can stop God's plans for his children. All things happen in the fullness of time. And I would say no one is here by accident, as you said, and everybody has a purpose. So our goal is to train our hearts and our ears to that calling so we don't miss it. And to make sure that neither fear nor laziness nor complacency guides us or the masses. Rather that we should stand firm to the teachings of God and His Word, and no matter what the world tells us, to constantly keep our ears open and to follow what it is He specifically asks of each of us individually, because it is an individual ask. And if we don't, we're really hurting the entire body.
I think that was perfectly well said, Susie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to have you.
My pleasure.
Just as Deborah accepted her role as a judge and a prophetess and allowed God to do what is fit for her, may we also allow God to work in our lives and allow Him to shape His plan and vision, and know and believe that His plan and vision is wiser and more superior than ours. Until next time, have a blessed day.